Okay, tonight we're very fortunate. A year ago, August, we had a speaker, and he gave a wonderful talk. His name is Dave Pequet, and it was the history of Duck Lake, and it was an exceptional kind of program, and so it's on YouTube if you're interested in watching it. Anyway, Dave is a Michigan State grad from Grand Rapids, and I always love these stories where basically he came up to Duck Lake as a scout to Grand Rapids Camp Shaughnessy, and then somehow, you know, people come and explore White Lake and Duck Lake and our western Michigan area, and then they somehow never forget it, and somehow there's always a story about the couple that sailed into White Lake and thought, gee, what a nice place, and then they ended up retired here, kind of thing. Alice Gamble, for instance, you know, that sort of thing. Anyway, the camp closed, and the property was purchased in 1985. Dave is also a member of the Duck Lake Riparian Owners Association. He has an investment firm in Hinsdale, Illinois, has a wonderful complex at the upper end of Duck Lake. And I find that I worked in city planning and stuff like that, doing master plans and things like that out in California, and that doing, you know, just watching the evolution of obviously, you know, camps and what happens, and the interest, and, you know, Mr. Subdivider wants to knock it into 150 condos or something like that, and then ultimately kind of what happens, it involves a great deal of citizen participation, input in master plans and things like that, and the end result is that sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, and tonight we're going to be talking with basically a winner, and so Dave Pequet, you could tell us a story about Duck Lake.
Thank you, Roger. Appreciate it.
I feel like I'm doing it. Cheryl just said, Dave is very organized. He just passes on to us. All right, I'll pass it around, and it'll end up in the White Lake, in the Montague Museum. But it's a wonderful book that basically about his talk. This talk also will probably end up on YouTube because it's being filmed back there. Dave Pequet, there you go.
Thank you, Roger. Appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of the scout camps and where we are today. It's kind of interesting. We always refer to the camps over there as scout camps, but the YMCA had a camp for a number of years that I've spent 50-some years here, and didn't even realize that until about 10 years ago. So at any rate, but really one of the first scouts, if you will, was Mears, who through Massachusetts and on to Chicago, and then came to this area, bought, when he was all done, he bought 40,000 acres in western Michigan, but he bought 2,000 acres in Duck Lake from the government at $1.25 an acre. Built a settlement down by the channel that they called Cork Point, and by the end of the 1800s, the entire area was logged off, and he went on to log the rest of Michigan, western Michigan. So one could say that he was really one of the first scouts of the area. But the camp picture looks like this. There was a YMCA camp, which is really the first camp on Duck Lake in 1907. Went through 1922. Then for 1 year there was a Muskegon YMCA. Then Camp Wabanengo was 1921, and Camp Shaughnessy was 1928. So we'll kind of go through a little bit of history on all three camps, and then what transpired afterwards. So early postcard of Central YMCA. Is there any way we can maybe turn one light off, do you think? It might, is that a little better, perhaps, for contrast? This is actually, right here is the picnic pavilion right now. So this is west of the picnic pavilion. You've got the point right here, and then you go out to the channel. So this is a very early look of the YMCA camp in 1908. Part of my interest in history has been trying to get as many, and the internet now allows you to do a lot of work on researching newspapers. So I've found a number of kind of interesting clippings. This one goes all the way back to August of 1907. It's the first known piece of in any newspaper that I've found on Duck Lake and the camps, but it talks about this year's group of 14 boys, they were actually older than boys. They all had jobs at various companies in Chicago, but they would hike every day to downtown Muskegon, 10 miles along Lake Michigan. And that was their daily, and the newspaper article tells about that. So it's pretty impressive. And that wasn't down Scenic Drive, because there was no Scenic Drive. That was along the shore. And they made quite a to-do in downtown Muskegon every day. These are two postcards, the oldest two postcards I have in my collection, and they happen to be of the YMCA camp. And swimming was a major part of the YMCA culture. They built their first pool in Brooklyn, New York in 1885, pretty amazing. They had their first filtration plant for a swimming pool in 1909. And in 1909, they started a major campaign that they wanted to teach every man and young boy in the country how to swim. And so they brought in a Canadian, actually a Canadian came in and pitched them on how to do this. And he had a radical new approach of teaching swimming in group lessons, which I guess wasn't done to that time, having a lot of instruction on land. And then he introduced a new stroke called the crawl, which is obviously very common today, but it was an easier stroke to learn. And so he ran all over the country, and one of his claim to fame is he taught 800 kids in New Jersey in 1 week how to swim. And so it's just interesting. Duck Lake, over the years, through these 3 scout camps, or the YMCA and the 2 scout camps, have taught literally thousands of kids how to swim. That's kind of cool. This is another clip a couple years later. They talked about just daily life at the camp. One of the quotes, "The rising gong starts at 6:30 a.m. Everyone has to get up at that time or in the lake they go." The article was about you would get dunked if you didn't do your chores. You'd get dunked if you did this or did that. But there was a couple of other interesting comments. They had a baseball team, and we played the summer resorters at Michelinda and beat them 21-7. And then further in the article, it says, "It's a shame to tell you what we did to the Heinz's Colts on the opposite shore of Duck Lake. We left them a score of 14-7. So that was in the Chronicle. And again, a few years later, Duck Lake Y Camp grows in popularity. Here's a picture of the surplus World War I tents that they used back then, which had to get pretty hot in August days. But the quote was, "A few camps have chosen a more fitting site. It's the largest and most perfectly organized of the Y camps. The perfect elements, including no difficulty in securing provisions, has contributed to the success of the camp." So this is 103 years ago. Another interesting clip, that while the boys were off hiking to Muskegon, somebody came in and robbed their campsite and took all their operating cash of $300, but more importantly, took all their boat tickets back home, 100 ferry tickets. But the article goes on, and the ferry company was kind enough to give them new tickets. But and again, this is the area right over here would be the current pavilion. So 1923, the Y Camp changed control from Chicago to Muskegon. It was opened 1 year, and then they left in 24. They moved to the Big Blue Lake, and the camp's now called Camp Pendleton. The Y never owned property. They always leased property. But you really don't, in conversation, everyone talks about the scout camps. They really don't talk about the Y. And the Y was there as long. They were the first camp on the North Shore. Wabanengo was the second camp that came. Wabanengo, named after an Ottawa Indian chief that lived in the White Lake area in the early 1800s. Actually, when Mears came here first, there was about 3,000 Ottawa Indians, and the Indian chief Wabanengo was the chief of the group at that time. It's the first known picture of Camp Wabanengo. Now there's the point. So this is on the other side. This is on the inlet side of the channel, and right about where the boat landing is right now. The boat landing is right about here. So in the summer of 1920, 8 older scouts attending Camp Wasapee from Evanston Council hiked the White Lake area to explore for future campsites. After seeing the north side of Duck Lake and the channel Lake Michigan, they enthusiastically telegraphed their committee back in Evanston. That committee made a trip, and shortly thereafter they purchased 100 acres for $10,000 from Carrie Mears, who was the daughter of Mr. Mears, Charles, and the camp opened in 1921. We have some interesting documentation, compliments of Van Dake, who family was the Austins. I believe it's her great-grandmother. They built the Michelinda Beach Lodge. She was kind enough to share this. She had a number of correspondence from the scout camp to her great-grandfather, I believe. And it's interesting, there's they bought 475 acres for $25,000, and they paid $12,500 in cash and $12,000 in a mortgage. And then a year later, in 1927, they spun off 250 acres that they sold to Camp Schwanensee. But there's an interesting, and I don't know if you can read it here, but it's kind of interesting how you may wonder why men of affairs show at this small stall at this small sum of $25,000. I can't read it, but at any rate, they're making excuse. You got all these big shots in Chicago that are buying the property, but they want to pay half down and mortgage it. So they got a paragraph here and address that. Obviously, their conscience was guilty or something, and they said, well, we're all big businessmen, but all our money's tied up, and so but our credit's good, and so we'll put half down, and if you'll take a mortgage, and you can, because we're big guys in Chicago, you'll easily be able to sell that mortgage. But they make all these excuses in the correspondence, and at any rate, so they bought the Evanston Council bought the property for $25,000 back in 1926. Here's an article that was in Boy's Life. This would have been the 4th year of the camp, but a group of scouts planted 20,000 white pine, Norway pine, and spruce in the area. It took them an entire summer to do that. They also, this article says, they planted 40 white birch in a circle a few miles from the camp and called it Roosevelt Circle, after Colonel Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who promised to bring back some rare trees from Tibet. I don't know where that was, if that transpired, but it's possibly, and I'm not certain why they would not have done it at the campsite and did it somewhere else. But 20,000 trees back then could account for an awful lot of the pine and trees that we have in the area right now. So 1929, there's a flyer. It's about 10 pages long. In just 8 years, the camp just mushroomed. It had its own hospital, it had its own post office, it had its own store, a full-blown waterfront. I mean, it really blossomed into a major boys camp in a fairly short period of time. So you ask, how do you get to camp? Well, they took the ferry boat, and in this flyer it talks about for $5, it was about $25 for a week at camp, and for $5 you got a round-trip ticket from Chicago and back. And so this is Lakeside Inn right now. So there was a dock called Michelinda Dock, and these big ferry boats would come in, and Goodrich Transit was one of the major players, and they had about 6 or 7 ferry boats. But in the information in this flyer, it was interesting. It said, scouts going to Goodrich Transfer Company at Navy Pier, which is the big pier down in Chicago. with their parents in machines, not in autos, but they called it in machines. Must report to the officer in charge, the dock, by 8 o'clock. So I just stumbled on that and thought that was kind of, in machines, so kind of interesting. Here's a dining hall shot in 1925. They had generally 100 to 150 campers every week. 1937, again, a big crowd over in July. A picture of some of the campsites. They used 8-man tents, big World War I surplus tents, big wall tents, old heavy canvas tents is what the boys camped in. Whoops. Uh-oh. Here's a map, 1943 of Wabanengo, and it's done in caricatures, but it's interesting. They call the bay down here Bassarino Bay, and some of the fishermen in the room might concur with that. But and that appears and more than one time over 10 or 20 years. This Bassarino Bay reference. Another brochure in 1943. They're touting 387 acres, 12,000 feet of waterfoot frontage, 30 buildings, fully equipped hospital, $25 a week. Kind of interesting back 70 some odd years ago. And they had a lot of gear, 22 canoes, 16 rowboats, a Navy cutter, 2 snipes, a catboat, and then I got a kick out of this, a speedboat for aquaplaning. Not for water skiing, but for aquaplaning. I had never heard that before. Again, a few more campsite scenes. This is interesting here. They played reveille every morning with a bugle, and they had this is a big microphone, a big sheet metal microphone that was probably 6 or 8 feet long with an opening, and the bugler would play into that, and he'd point it 4 different directions. And so Camp Shaughnessy had the same thing. So we got reveille like about 8 or 10 times every morning, because they would point this microphone, north, east, south, and then Shaughnessy would do the same thing. And so that's kind of interesting. Again, some more shots of buildings. The campfire ring over at both camps had campfire rings, but this is a picture of the campfire ring at Wabanengo. It sat about 200. It was very large. Sat about 200 campers. The waterfront, they had a high dive. Again, this is right about where the boat lift or the boat landing is right now. Part of the swimming program was the buddy board. That was very typical in scout camps. So you always had a buddy that you swam with. You had a tag. That tag was color coded to signify if you were a good swimmer or beginner swimmer. And then you would buddy up and you'd put your tag on this board. There would be hooks, and every now and then they'd blow the whistle, and you had to raise your hand. You had to find your buddy, raise your hand, and if you didn't find your buddy, it was a huge issue. You always had to be close to your buddy, so they had a big organized. Again, in the 40s, a picture, a lot of boathouses on the lake. There's that diving tower right there. Boating was a big part of the scouting experience on Duck Lake for both camps. And so in the 50s, combined between the two camps, there was about 35 rowboats on the lake, 40 canoes, 4 sailboats, and each camp had 2 30-foot war canoes. So a war canoe is just a big oversized canoe, but you could have about 12 guys in it side by side, 2 abreast. And it was, this is a picture of a war canoe. And they would have races, timed races every week, and then the camps would compete against each other with timed races. And a sad note, when they packed up and left in '68, Shaughnessy had no use for their war canoes, and they just sunk them, which no one knew about that till after the fact, but at any rate. Dark days, again, nothing really want to dwell on too much, but in 1955 there was a scout that was kidnapped, and he was walking with his troop down Wabaningo Road, and for those that have been here a while, Wabaningo Road had a dog leg, and went around he was ahead of his crew, went around, and it was never seen again. And it was terribly tragic. This is a picture of the Chronicle. It's a bad copy, but there was a search party on the 12th. There was a number of search parties, but on the 12th, the state police, the local police, the sheriff, they had 1,500 searchers and 400 cars down at the channel. They searched a 25 square mile area unsuccessfully. But about 6 weeks later, the young man's body was found on Ford and Orshall roads. He had been murdered with a gunshot. It led off to an extensive search. It was in all the national newspapers. And they arrested, finally, about a year later, arrested a ex-convict and a real bad guy in Arizona. He was convicted, and shortly thereafter he actually appealed, acted as his own attorney, appealed, and then was reconvicted and died in prison. 1970 was Wabaningo's last season. In the fall of '68, the National Boy Scout Council headquarters pressured Evanston Council to merge and consolidate with another council in the area. It was not a popular situation and a lot of politics, but the scout camp that opened in 1921 and with one of the oldest Boy Scout organizations in Evanston going back to 1910. Their last summer was in 1970, and then the property was put up for sale. But in 1968, this is a flyer, and I like the title, "The Best Waterfront in the Midwest." So Duck Lake got an awful lot of good press on just being a great spot, as we all know. Camp Shaughnessy, that's really what I'm familiar with. I first attended Camp Shaughnessy in the summer of 1953 as a camper. Was there every summer through '68. I worked there in '68, and then continued when the camp shut down. Myself and a couple other fellas had the good fortune of being caretakers in the summer. So this was a sign of Camp Shaughnessy. It was on the corner of Scenic Drive in Wabaningo. Wabaningo is now gone, but there's a little turnaround there, and you probably remember that. The name, kind of an interesting, long drawn-out history on the name, but Camp Shaughnessy is named for the spirit of the south wind of the Song of Hiawatha, written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, a very famous American poet. He wrote a poem which was 22 chapters, kind of a long poem. And at any rate, there was a brother called Shaughnessy, and he fell in love with a dandelion, and which he mistakenly took for a golden-haired maiden. But so Shaughnessy is the spirit of the south wind, is the name originally. Also, kind of a little bit unknown is there was a Camp Shaughnessy before Camp Shaughnessy on Duck Lake, and it was on Lake Michigan in Port Sheldon, and it was actually there for 10 years. And so that was the original Camp Shaughnessy, and then in 1928 it was moved here. But so this is a picture on the shore, and you'll see a big, just to put things in perspective, that's a real big rescue boat. You've probably got 15 guys in there, and this is just a scene of their lakefront in about 1920. So So here is a map of Camp Shaughnessy that was a little smaller than Wabanengle, 224 acres, had about a half mile of lake frontage, although it had more campsites. It had 10 campsites. This is Nestrom Road right here. So you have the Badeaux down in this area. Up, this was Wabanengle Road, which is now abandoned. The old waterfront was right straight about in the middle of the lake, and it was funded basically by 4 men's clubs when they purchased it: the Lions Club, Kiwanis, Rotary, and Wolverine Club. When it was purchased from Wabanengle in 1927, and then it opened in 1928. Very fortunate to, about 10 years ago, I came across a photo collection that I discovered out of the U of M, and they had just worked with the Grand Rapids Public Library, but it was called the Morris Photo Collection, and Morris was a photographer for the Grand Rapids Herald, and he donated an awful lot of high-resolution pictures that had really been, no one had seen them for decades, but we were able to get copies of a lot of these, and the Grand Rapids Library was very instrumental in working with me on some of these photos. So here's a picture of the dedication day. It was a big day, and it was July 4th of 1928. A lot of news on it. It was a Senator Smith, who was a big senator at the time, just recently retired. He donated, he and his wife donated the money to build the dining hall in memory of their son that had recently died of meningitis, but he was in World War II as an aviator. And so there were a lot of dignitaries that came to this. It's interesting that Gerald Ford was 15 years old, a scout from Troop 215 at Trinity Methodist in Grand Rapids, and he was a member of the Honor Guard on July 4th for the dedication. It's also, and I just actually stumbled on this late Sunday night, was looking at some books on Gerald, and Gerald Ford wasn't born Gerald Ford. He was born Leslie King Jr., and his mother got divorced when he was about a year old, and so he went until he was in high school under the name of Leslie King Jr. And one of the first times that they ever saw him use Gerald Ford, which was the name of his stepfather, was on his Shaughnessy application in 1928. And so, kind of interesting. Here's a picture of the first staff, the first set of campers at the new camp in 1928. It's interesting to note up in this area, that's Jerry holding the flag up. He was part of the color guard, and two fellows over on the left with a flag, and Jerry and another fellow over on the right. This is the dining hall. It was the premier building on the property. It was donated by Senator Smith. It was probably 75 or 80 feet wide and 150 feet long. It was just a spectacular building, and I took some. This doesn't do its justice. It's a lot of these photographs from this collection are very high resolution, so you could really see a lot of detail. But I just thought it was interesting. I did some clips, so things really haven't changed. If you look over here, you have all the women are grouped together, and you look over here, you got all the men grouped together. And this was the grand opening, and so if you look over on this end and you blow it up right here, you still have some guys painting windows. So the party's going, they're out on the porch and having their lunch and whatnot, but you still got guys over here painting the windows because they're not quite done yet. This is the inside of the dining hall and some of the dignitaries. Gleason, Sinke, Senator William Alden Smith, and his wife. You'll probably recognize the name Senator Arthur Vandenberg, was a famous Michigan senator going back in the 20s and 30s. Jack Bauer, Whitman, they were from some of the men's groups. And then John Blodgett, you certainly recognize that name from the hospital and the Blodgett family. And then George Miller, who is the end gentleman here, he actually was very instrumental in the Boy Scouts and raising money for this, but then he also went on to be camp director for about 17 years. This is just a goofball picture of the band that was in this guy's collection, so I thought it was kind of interesting. They had dressed up. They thought it was Halloween, I guess. First camper season. This was in one of the books, one of the biographies written on Gerald Ford, but you'll see they had 2-man tents at Shaughnessy, and in Wabanengo they had 8-man tents, but and I recall this as a camper, everything was on wooden platforms. They called them duck boards. I don't know why they called them duck boards, but there's a quote in this, The Education of Gerald Ford. Camp opened the 28th of June 1928, Jerry arrived with the rest of the staff, and a week early to put down the wooden duck boards and went beneath the tents and policed a new site for killing off most of the rattlesnake population. So, and that popped up a couple different times. So I guess there was some rattlesnakes on the north side of the lake. This is another segment. In 1927, Fred Pantlin, and you recognize that name with the Pantlin Hotel, they had made Fred was second generation. The Pantlin Hotel actually goes back before the Civil War, and so they had been very wealthy, and they had a lot of property down in Holland, and he was a next door neighbor of the scout camp when it was in Holland. So he donated a 72-foot sailboat to the Sea Scouts. It was called the Nadant, and Jerry in 1929 was part of the Sea Scouts, and so that schooner was actually headquartered out of Duck Lake, not in Duck Lake but offshore. And so Jerry had just joined the Sea Scouts that summer, and they were taking one of their maiden voyages, and they were going up to the Mackinac Island, and they got, on the second day, they got off Manistee and had engine problems and had an engine fire and burned the boat to the waterline, which was tragic, and three boys got seriously burned. But Jerry was fortunate. He had commitments that week at the scout camp as a counselor and didn't go on that trip. Here's another group picture in 1929 when Jerry was 16 years old, and it was his second year of being a staff member. He was an Eagle Scout by the end of the year. And again, I don't know if it's coincidence, but he's over on the right side, and he's holding up the flagpole, so that was kind of a interesting spot for him in 2 or 3 of these major photographs that we have. And of course, Jerry went on to be a president, and all the good things that we know about him as a congressman. The council is named after him in Grand Rapids, and just a few weeks ago, the USS Gerald Ford, a new aircraft carrier, a new class of aircraft carriers, was christened and is operational now, and it's a new category. It's the largest, most sophisticated, most expensive aircraft carrier ever made, and it's pretty impressive. So, a big part of Shaughnessy in the 30s was they put on an Indian pageant, and a tremendous amount of time and effort. It was really renowned and all over the Midwest. It would be 1 or 2 days a week. It was written and produced, and here is an actual flyer for it. It was held down on the waterfront. They attracted 2,000 or 3,000 people a week would come for this event when it was in the summer, and it was really a pretty impressive thing. The play was written and directed by George Miller, who was one of the founding people putting the camp together, and then he continued to be their director for about 17 years. He had done a play called The Lost Tribe of Shawandisi. It made the papers. They do reviews on it every summer, and it was really quite a production. They had lighting, they had like speakers, and it was a big deal. The pageant closes with the scene of scouts listening in awe to the spirit storyteller. They promise to care and love the land of the vanished tribe if they camp here. The chief then in sign language gives them the birds, animals, trees, and waters, steps back into the spirit canoe and vanishes into the lake. It was a pretty big event, and that went on for about a decade. More pictures of the Shawandisi waterfront. There was, right in front of the dining hall, there was what was called the quarter deck. It was like a two-story building. This is right about dead center in the lake, looking across. Again, some really nice pictures from another collection. You may remember in Grand Rapids a photo studio called the Robinson Studio that was a big photography studio for a number of decades, and they had they actually donated 950,000 negatives to the Grand Rapids Library, but it was all negatives, and I was fortunate to make friends with someone that was on the data collection team, and they pulled out about 50 photos of Shawandisi for us, and pretty neat. In the 50s, again, it's from the same photo collection, but the Lions Club was very active, donated a lot of time and money, actually helped build a lot of the buildings over there. And so this is from a work weekend, and you'd get all these dads and members of the Lions Club would come up for 3 days, and they would help open up the camp in June and unpack things and get things rolling. And so this is a picture of their crew in the dining hall. Another waterfront picture, high resolution, a little bit of a interesting story on this as well. So I'm looking, I get all these high resolutions, and they're very small, but they're very high resolution. And I just happen to, and I get 50 or 60 of them, and they're all, a lot of them are similar. I'm looking at this one, and I look a little closer, and I say, wow, I know that guy. And it turns out that's my uncle. That was there in 1949, and I've got hundreds of photos. I don't know why I put this on my computer and blew it up bigger, and there he was, and here is a picture of him at a campsite. His name was Roger Chaffee, and he right over here, this headdress was given to me, and he made that headdress, and he was part of the Order of the Arrow induction team when he was assistant waterfront director in 1951. So stumbled on that picture, and it's got some interesting personal history, and then I have that actual headdress right there. And then that's me in the year after with that headdress on, and I was 1 year old. So, and this just kind of all came together the last couple of years. Roger was an astronaut. He was flew in the Navy, and it was Apollo 1, and was killed in the Apollo 1 fire in 1967, along with Ed and Gus Grissom. So. Interesting, he was also from the same scout troop that Ford was from. They were both from the same 215 out Grand Rapids Trinity Methodist. A few more pictures in the 60s. I really like this one where this guy's fixing the pulley on the flagpole. This war canoe, a big deal every week, these war canoe races, and they'd be timed and very competitive. My favorite was what was called the Monkey Bridge, which is right here. There was a big parade ground on top of the hill, about center of the camp. The parade ground was probably 100 yards by 300 yards, no trees, all just sand. That's where the flagpole was. That's where they would, you would have the call of colors. But they had a monkey bridge, which was 2 tripods and a big 1-inch hawser that went for about 200 feet. And you could walk down that. It had side ropes, and it was everybody'd wait in line all day long to take a shot at the monkey bridge. The end of Shawandasee came a little different, where Camp Wabaningo was a kind of a consolidation effort. Shawandasee was doing very well, and they needed more space, so they needed to expand. In the beginning of the end, this is a newspaper article, local in February 1968, where they were beginning to raise money to buy a new camp. 1968, the last season, again, kind of close to me. I was a dishwasher that year for $15 a week, plus all I could eat. This is my application, and I was on probation even as a dishwasher for 30 days. So they could have let me go if I didn't do a good job dishwashing after 30 days. So at any rate. For 60 years, thousands of young men came to Duck Lake learning to camp, swim, boat, be leaders, and enjoy and appreciate Mother Nature. It all came to an end in 1970 when Wabaningo also closed its doors. So Shawandasee's last year was 68 and Wabaningo was 70. A new chapter opened in the 70s and 80s as ownership transfer and the fate of the North Shore, Duck Lake, and channel to Lake Michigan began to unfold. So this was disheartening to many, but for sale, prime undeveloped parcel in southwest Michigan, 12 miles north of Muskegon, 600 acres, 1.5 mile shoreline on the north side of beautiful Duck Lake, channel into Lake Michigan, and a 1/2 mile frontage on Lake Michigan. 2 separate ownerships, 19 structures related to summer camp, and the list price was $815,000. Pretty incredible. This was a picture of the waterfront in 1972. So you can see this is a dining hall. All the buildings stayed up until the state purchased the property, but you can see it has started to grow over. Now this is just completely overgrown. You still can see a little white sand over here. This is a little bluff with some pine trees, and you can see that. If you go there now, you can see the foundation, and there's a monument there as well. A little bit of good news, for 3 years the rumors were just constant. I mean, the fear, like Roger mentioned, was developers coming in. And for 3+ years, constant rumors of residential land developers parading through the camp property, and visions of sprawling subdivisions gave local residents high anxiety. Some relief came when news that the state of Michigan DNR Parks and Recs Division made a formal request to the Nature Conservancy, nonprofit land bank headquartered in Washington, to purchase the property and hold it for a short period of time until the state could fund the purchase of the property for construction of a new state park. This is actually the letter, copy of the letter that the state sent to the Nature Conservancy requesting this. And then the process accelerated a little bit when a Philadelphia land developer, Matthews Phillips, purchased 14 acres just south of the channel and was going to put up 18 houses. And he got an option on all 600 acres. So that really made people nervous. It actually turned out to be a good thing because I think it got the Nature Conservancy off dead center to focus on it. But can you imagine 18 houses being on the south side of the channel right now. It would have been a whole different program for sure. So 1974 is when the state got the money to purchase back from the Nature Conservancy. They got a $400,000 grant from the U.S. Department of Interior. They bought the property for $714,000. There was a sigh of relief that there was not going to be any major housing developments. The property was still owned on the south side of the channel by that developer, but the fact that the state now owned the north side, that worked out well. So from this point forward, there was 6 years of planning. And there was, when the state initially purchased the property, they were talking of a rustic campsite, not a lot of development, and that's what everyone thought was going to happen. And so 6 years later, believe it or not, then their study comes out, their master plan comes out, and they roll that out in March of 1980. And they actually had hearings right here. Actually, there was some hearings here, but I think most of the hearings were at the high school in Whitehall because there was too many people that they wouldn't fit here, and so they had hearings at the high school. But what had happened over the 6 years is that the rustic plan went to the wayside, and so the plan that the state was rolling out was for 200 campsites, 500 cars, and they anticipated to have 250 to 300,000 visitors a year. It was going to be a full-blown park and a total development of the entire parcel. Obviously, that was not what the community had thought was going to happen, and so an awful lot of opposition and organized opposition developed to fight that. And what happened was a group of residents formed a committee called CALM, C-A-L-M, Concerned About Land Water Management. And they worked just tirelessly for a number of years in organizing and lobbying the DNR to go back to their rustic plan. And one of the kind of the highlights of their effort, there were 3 days of testimony in Lansing, and a number of residents of CALM, they all got together and they did a motorcade, and they all went to Lansing and they testified for 3 days, and really it was a real strong effort to try to tone down the development. And so what happened was there was so much pressure that the DNR formed a Duck Lake State Advisory Park Commission, and it was made up of residents and officials and park officials. And that committee met frequently for a year, and then they submitted a 4-phase plan to the DNR on how they would like to see the property developed. And phase 1 included removing the scout buildings and the access roads, installing a 100-car parking lot down by the channel and a boat launch. And so the DNR accepted this plan, and they executed on phase 1, and there was no timetable on phase 2. The park opened in 1988, and phase 2 hasn't come about yet. So I think in the end, all the hard work by an awful lot of people to try to protect the north side paid off. We owe, I feel strongly, we owe a lot of gratitude to, I called it our greatest generation, but over a decade of organized, passionate objection by lake and local residents paid off, and the development threat of the huge new state park project was minimized. Hundreds of citizens gave thousands of hours of effort to this cause, and I listed, I was fortunate to get the estate papers of a gentleman by the name of Hans Bart, and I probably have 200 or 300 pages of correspondence of all the letters that they wrote. And Hans lived, if you know the house that Risseys had, so Hans gave it to Bruce Rissey, Bruce Rissey gave it to me, and so I'm sure I left out a lot of people, but Hans Bart, Dave and Mary Lou Badeau, Carl Benson, Stuart Ferguson, Glenn Glaser, Dick Hayne, Ken Hampel, Charlie Heitzman, Jim Cobson, and Carol Wood were just always part of this committee and this effort. And this is a letter right here from the governor to Hans, kind of acknowledging. I mean, these guys wrote letters. They went to meetings. They really worked hard. So I think you know, we owe a lot to what they did 30, 40 years ago.
Can you read that letter?
Sure. This is to acknowledge and thank you for sending your thoughts on the proposed plans for the Duck Lake State Park, Muskegon County. I have been advised that the Parks Division of the Department of Natural Resources had a public hearing in Whitehall on March 20th to discuss the Duck Lake State Park plans. I am further advised that you are scheduled to speak before the Department of Natural Resources Commission on April 10th, 1980. I trust these contacts with the DNR will address your concerns. So what all this local effort did was to drive hearings down in Lansing, which were a big deal. And these people were part of that group that went down there. So just a little epilogue. It's worth a hike over there to see a group of us back in 2000, old staff guys. We started meeting there every Saturday before every Father's Day, and we would all go over there and have a cookout. And then in 2006, we put some money together and went to the DNR, which was a project in and of itself, to get permission to bring a heavy truck in. And so we had this monument made, but to bring a heavy truck in and then set this monument on the corner of the old foundation. But we got that accomplished. And when you walk over there, you can see that. It's worth a visit. And just a little, my family goes over there. Big thing to take my grandkids on hikes. And so this is my son and my little granddaughter. A couple years ago, we had a cookout over on the site of the old campsite. And last but not least, this and this isn't a good picture, Benji laughs, but there's an axe head in a big pine tree, and you'll never find it unless you know where to look. Unless you know where the axe yard was. But what it was about in the center of the camp, and they had a big thing on safety. And so they had a big tennis shoe with an axe through it right by the big toe, and it had a sign there, "This is what happened to the kid that wasn't paying attention with his axe." And in the first day of scout camp, they would come show everybody that, you know, all the 10, 12-year-olds with, oh, goodness gracious. And so it's long gone, but the axe head is still there. So, and I could show it to you. Benji's been there every time he sends me a picture. He goes hiking. But at any rate, I appreciate your time. And
Thank you.
Any questions? Yes?
I had a professor who talked about camping there, not as a kid, but with his family. But it didn't sound from your history like there was such a thing.
What that could have been is you could bring, if you were a counselor, like a troop master, you could bring your family. They had what was called a family unit. So you could bring your family. It was like a kind of a hotel type brick building, but
In the 80s, so.
I'm not aware of. You know, the camp opened in 80, 88. The park rather.
You may have been there without permission.
Could have been. Yes, Tom.
Tom Hamilton. I'd like to add to your story on 1970. 1970 and 71, I was the park ranger at my park degree for Muskegon State Park. Also in 1971, just by coincidence, was when the motorcycle hill climb was here. Back in those days, we had the Chicago Outlaws, the Common Shells, the Hells Angels, and they all come to town and showed up. On a Friday night, Al Moorfield and I were the only ones on duty. They all come piling in, cruising into Snug Harbor. And he's watching all these motorcycles go by. Tom, they don't have permit. Go kick them out. I said, who, me? I'm a little kid. So I walk over there, and the guys are all flopped out drinking beer. And they laughed like heck when I come walking in there with my little uniform. And I was laughing too, and the guy said, I suppose we ain't following your rules. And I said, well, no, but guys, I understand fully. I said, hey, I'd like to help you out, you know. There's a real neat place. You don't bother nobody. You'll like it, and you won't have to follow any rules. It's just relax and enjoy yourself. And he said, what are you talking about? I said, well, we're putting together this little place, Duck Lake up here, and no problem. And the guy said, man, we really appreciate this. Would you like a beer? And I said, not yet. I'm not off duty. So all of a sudden I walked back, and the motorcycles are just streaming out of there just very nicely, and Al's mouth dropped open. He said, what in the heck did you tell them? I just sent them up to Duck Lake State Park with the beach is. Oh Christ, my kids are up there camping out. And that was my introduction to Duck Lake State Park.
Very cool. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
The Vassarino was a lure.
Oh, was it? Okay. Good to know.
A wonderful lure.
Was it?
Hanging on a
Oh, wow, okay.
rod.
I'll be darned. Well, reference to that bay as that appeared quite a few times, so must be an old lure.
Yeah.
So, yes, ma'am.
What impression did the Depression have on the campsite?
A great question, and I don't think a lot. $25 a week was a fair amount of money in those years, but both camps flourished through that time period, and they were full. And now full was 150 campers a week from all over the kind of Michigan and the Chicagoland area, but yeah, they didn't feel, as far as I can tell. Yes, Roger.
Yeah, question. Now that the Scouts don't have this, and there's, I don't know if there's, I haven't to Camp Pendaloo, I don't know why Camp Blue Lake, but like, do you think the Scouts have any regret about?
Huge regret. Yeah, no. They bought Shawandacy bought a reservation in the center part of the state, which was just sand and jack pines. It didn't take long for them to regret that. It was on a small lake. It's just the move was very political for both councils, the Chicago Council and the Grand Rapids Council. I think both of them, part of it was somewhat greed, that they thought they could sell the property quickly and for a lot of money. Neither one of those things happened. And so the camp that Shawandacy went to closed in about 10 years, and now they go to Owassapee. And then the Chicago has a couple of Wisconsin camps. But, you know, now they look back and they say, oh, man, you know, all that Lake Michigan frontage and Duck Lake. And so, yeah, the hindsight's pretty clear. And there was always, and anyone that had ever camped there or worked there was really disappointed, because the new reservation was right in the center of the state. It was god-awful hot. The lake was about 9 feet deep. I mean, it was just, but, and it came and went. It closed about 10 years later. So, thank you very much. Appreciate it.